Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. My name is Matthew Felix, and I'm here today with Natalie Baszile, author of the novel Queen Sugar, which was not only nominated for an NAACP Image Award, but also made into a TV series produced and directed by Ava DuVernay for the Oprah Winfrey Network, or OWN. Natalie's new book is the forthcoming We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African-American farmers, land, and legacy. Natalie's nonfiction work has appeared in Lenny Letter, The Bitter Southerner, Oh, the Oprah Magazine, TheRumpus.net, and a number of other anthologies. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you.
Can you give us just a quick high-level overview of what the book's about?
Sure. So the book is an anthology of first-person narratives, portraits, articles and essays, stories, and sayings that really try to capture the history of Black people, mostly, and people of color on American soil from emancipation to the present.
Okay.
And it really tries to tell the story of Black farmers.
And it does an amazing job of it, as we're going to discuss. But why, for your second big publication, I mean, like I said, you've been published in lots of different places, but your second book, why an anthology versus sticking with fiction, and why an anthology about Black farmers and Black farming?
Yeah, so I was approached by my editor, Tracy Sherrod at Amistad/HarperCollins. And she really wanted to do, her first idea was to do what she called a Queen Sugar TV tie-in book. And I was like, what would that be? I don't know what that would be, right? I'm not involved with the production of the show. And so I don't have, I can go to the set, but I don't have access to, the cast or scripts or anything like that. And so when I thought about what kind of book I would want to do, I thought that this would be, since it's nonfiction, I thought that this would be a good idea to kind of continue to explore a lot of the themes and ideas that I was curious about when I was writing Queen Sugar. But this was an opportunity for me to do it with the real people, right? And it was a chance for me to kind of tell an even bigger story, not just about what's happened to Black farmers and farmers of color in the past, but to carry that forward into the future and look at the things that were happening now. So it was kind of Queen Sugar, the real life version, and it was just an opportunity for me to explore something that I've always been passionate about.
One of the stories that you tell in the foreword, you cite a particular story. Actually, there are two, but I'm going to ask you about one of the stories you cite in the foreword that sort of sparked or deepened your interest in Black farmers, issues of land stewardship, and food justice. And this is related to the two grocery stores. Could you share that, please?
Yeah. So years ago, when I was in college, I had my Uncle Lewis on my dad's side was one of our only relatives who lived in the Bay Area. He lived in San Francisco. And when I was in college, I used to go over once a month just to visit him. He was an older, he was a senior citizen and lived by himself. And I would always take him a bag of groceries. Well, on this particular day, I was running late, and I went to Berkeley undergrad, I should say.
Right.
And so rather than stopping at the Safeway that was in Berkeley, where all of the students shopped, I stopped at this Safeway in Oakland and honestly was horrified at the difference in the quality of the produce. It was terrible. It was terrible. There was limited produce, limited selection. What was there was, withered and old. And I just was kind of personally offended that, here, this Safeway that was the exact same chain that I shopped at in, up the road in Berkeley, in this market that served Black and brown people, the quality was so inferior. And I didn't say anything to anybody. I just, went around and gathered what I could. But that stuck with me as kind of an early injustice and a real example of the disparity between, what uh, privileged, mostly white folks had access to, and what Black and Brown people had access to. And I just always that just stayed with me
Right.
through the years.
Right. And there's a term for that that's sometimes used, and I think you actually use it in the book, food apartheid, right?
Absolutely.
Which a lot of
Yes,
people probably haven't heard that term, but that speaks
that's
to that
right.
disparity that's often seen.
Exactly.
So I want to give some more context before we dive deeper into the book about the breadth and depth and severity of a lot of the issues that you cover in the book, because there are a lot of statistics, and I think they shed a lot of light again on the issues that are covered in the book. So all of these are statistics from the book itself. So the first one I want to read: Black farms have declined by as much as 98% by the end of the 20th century. And it is estimated that Black farmers cultivate less than half of 1% of the country's farmland today. So that's staggering. Black families have lost more than 1.5 million acres of land because of racism in America. And I think I've seen things that suggest it might even be more than that, but still,
Mhm.
just to give an idea of the scale, right? And then the last statistic that I'll read: a group of economists and statisticians recently calculated that since 1910, Black families have been stripped of hundreds of billions of dollars because of lost land. So those, like I said, staggering statistics that I think really contextualize a lot of what we're going to talk about. Now, there were also, of course, not surprisingly, a lot of themes throughout this book that came up, repeatedly. One theme, the first essay in the book is called "Everyone Beneath Their Own Vine and Fig Tree: A Remembering," in 7
Mhm.
parts by Michael Twitty. There's a poem later on, "Remember," by Joe Harjo. So remembering the past, the connection to ancestors, that's a theme, like I said, throughout the book. Can you tell us why you started with that particular theme?
It's my belief, and this is something that goes all the way back to even when I was writing Queen Sugar, that in the Black community, because we have had this very complicated history with land, right? Um, when part of our history, as we have been taught, is a history of enslavement, as Black people have progressed through the generations, the message that we have all been taught for the most part is move forward. Progress equals education. Progress equals migration away from the land, away from the soil. And so over the years, there has been, and understandably, there has been a narrative that has um, really not valued a connection to the soil, right? Because if you have your hands in the dirt, that means you're unsophisticated. It means that you are, probably downtrodden, right? It ties too closely back to our history of enslavement. When in fact, if we kind of widen the lens and we look at um, our larger history, we have to acknowledge that Black people, descendants of African people have a rich agricultural history, right? That's part of the reason why we were brought to this country, was because of this agricultural expertise. So this idea of remembering is something that to me means looking at our full history and appreciating the richness of our history and really trying to reclaim that narrative or reclaim that legacy and also shift the narrative about what it means to be connected to the land. It's not a negative thing. It's actually a tremendous source of strength and empowerment, in my opinion.
Well, and besides not being a negative thing, I mean, if there's such an importance on remembrance, then the implication, of course, is that if Black farmers, Black folks don't remember, then they're losing
Exactly.
out. So, what are,
Exactly.
just at a high level, because I know that's a huge question too,
Mhm.
but what are some of the consequences of not remembering?
Well, for example, one of the things that has been super important to me, one of these themes, right? These narrative threads is this question of intergenerational wealth, right? And if you don't have access to that, if you have walked away from here, Fannie Lou Hamer has a quote where she says, "If you lose the land, you lose everything." And this idea of land ownership, land stewardship, is really essential, right, to your ability to thrive and to pass something on to future generations. We have to acknowledge that, all of this land in this country was stolen from Native Americans. So, land stewardship is part of this. But when we think about Black people and people of color participating in this American experiment that is grounded in land ownership and land stewardship and being able to pass that land on to other generations, I really was trying to kind of sound the alarm that if we don't really think of this differently, we're going to look up and Black people won't we won't
Nope.
have any connection to the land. And
Right.
that goes, that's food sovereignty, that's so many other issues.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about that and the idea of legacy in
Mhm.
a little bit. There's one last angle though that I want to touch on related to remembering. This is sort of like I said, a different angle on this that really I thought was really interesting, and we're going to get a little metaphysical for a second.
Okay.
But in Ancestral Vibrations: Guide Our Connection to the Land by Jim Embry, he says, "Quote: About 6 years ago, my cousins asked me to move back to our extended family's farm to look after my 90-year-old aunt and uncle. I didn't quite understand as clearly then as I do now that the voices of my ancestors were speaking through my cousins and providing clues to the paths ahead of me." So, is the implication that remembering the past isn't merely calling something, or isn't merely recalling something that was, but no longer is, but rather that the past is living and we can
Absolutely.
actively connect with it in the present by remembering?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Memory is an active thing, right? I mean, it has as much to do with who I am today and tomorrow as it does with who I was or who my mother was or who my great grandmother was, generations before me. We are on a continuum, right? And it is essential, I think, that we understand ourselves as being part of an unfolding story, and we draw strength from the past. That's what I do, right?
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
tremendously proud of my family's uh, experience dating all the way back to slavery as far as we can trace it, because there's strength there.
So we've already touched on this next question, but I want to touch on it maybe one more time just to make sure we've
Okay.
kind of gone deep enough related to this. And that is just this idea of the importance of the land itself. I mean,
Mhm.
we're talking about farming. Some of it's kind of obvious, some of it's nostalgic, some of it's, I mean, just the basic importance that food comes from the land. But can you give us a little more context about why, starting from the very beginning in this country, not only the land, but more specifically land ownership has been so fundamental to African Americans?
Well, because we were deprived of that, right? I mean, our whole history of enslavement here has been about not even seeing us as human beings, let alone people who are deserving of any kind of uh, opportunity to participate in this American experiment, right? This is we this the history of Black people is the history of disenfranchisement. At the same time that we were the people on whose backs this country was built, right? We were the people who built the Capitol, right? We were the people who were tilling the soil, right? That allowed European planters, rice, tobacco, sugarcane, right? Black people were doing the labor. And so to think about that history of our engagement with the soil, right? And the expertise that we brought with us to the American, colonies. When you reflect on that, and then you consider all the ways that we have been disenfranchised and not allowed to own land, whether it's on the coast of South Carolina,
The
right?
40
Whether it
mills.
is in cities, right? I mean, when you really start to expand and you start to think about all the ways that we have been um, systematically blocked from ownership.
That's the next thing that I want to talk about actually is, so we've established just how important, how essential land has been or is to Black empowerment, self-determination, prosperity, health, and happiness. And yet historically, as you've just touched on, but I want to go a little further here, this book illustrates in painful and illuminating detail the obstacles that from day one have been put between Black farmers in particular and Black ownership. There's so many examples, specific examples in the book, but I want to touch on a couple specific ones. The first one I want to start with is the Farm Service Administration, or the FSA, because there are so many indictments of the FSA throughout this book. I mean, it comes up over and over and over again. So for people who don't know, can you tell us, this is kind of a three-part question, what the FSA is, what role it's supposed to play, and that what role it has actually played relative to Black farmers and land ownership?
Sure. So the FSA is the Farm Service Administration. I think that's what it is.
Yes.
It is a branch of the USDA. Okay. The USDA was started back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The purpose of the USDA was to provide education and financial support in the form of loans to American farmers. Okay. And education, um, information about farming techniques, whatever was the newest, latest information, and financial support in the form of being able to lend money.
Right.
That is the purpose of the USDA, that was supposed to be available to all American farmers. When it came to Black farmers, the local agents all around the country in all these little towns, right, who were in charge of the local FSA, those, and they were always white men, those FSA agents at the local level treated these federal funds as their own kind of private pocketbooks,
Mhm.
and decided who in their community had access to information, but most importantly, who had access to the funds that the government was supposed to distribute to farmers to allow them to farm. By this time, Black people had been emancipated and were looking to farm, looking to own land and begin their farms. And so these local agents over the generations systematically deployed these tactics that deprived Black farmers from access to those resources. So, for example, you are supposed to, let's say the farming season begins in January and it goes all the way through December. In the fall, October, November of the previous year, that's when most farmers apply for their loans, okay? So that when the new year comes and they've harvested their crop, they have the money to go out and buy their seeds, go out and buy their fertilizer, whatever they need, so that when the weather clears and the harvest season begins, or the farming season begins, planting, they'll be ready. These local agents, time and again, denied Black people's loan applications if they didn't go ahead and just tear them up and destroy them. If they allowed the Black farmers to process their applications, often those processes would be delayed. Or if their loans were approved and not denied, which they often were, then those agents delayed the distribution of the loans, so that these Black farmers who should have been planting in March, April, May, weren't planting until June, July, August. So they're behind, right? They're behind. You can't plant a crop and expect it to grow in time for you to be able to harvest it and get the yields that you want when you should have been planting in March or April, and now you're planting in June, July, or August. It's just not going to happen.
Right, right. And so there are a lot of stories where the FSA agent would leave the Black farmers sitting in the front office, wouldn't
Exactly.
take their calls, wouldn't return their calls,
Exactly.
and then they would give them the money when they didn't need it anymore.
Exactly.
So,
Or they would require farmers to take out more money than they could pay back,
mhm,
right?
right, another whole twisted
Right.
way of. So in the chapter called Resilience and Reinvention, Stanley Hughes summarizes this by saying,
Mhm.
quote, "The FSA put a lot of Black farmers out of business,
Yes.
and it's still happening today."
Yes.
So that
Yes.
kind of summarizes just how bad that situation is. Lots more to say there, but let's move on to a few other issues related to obstacles that have been put in the way of Black farmers and land ownership. Sharecroppers way back when were not, they would be told if you work a certain number of years for us, you get this property, it becomes your property. Then at the end of that term, the sharecroppers would change their mind. The black
Yeah.
farmers didn't get the land. That's one example. Another is lynchings. There's
Yeah.
this sort of common idea that a lot of the lynchings were because a black man was somehow making moves on a white woman or something, and it was
Right.
related to that. Whereas in reality, according to your book, oftentimes that was another way that they were actually taking land from black farmers.
Absolutely.
But the one I want to talk about next, though, is this is just another example that is so dubious and so convoluted that David Dietrich, former co-chair of the American Bar Association's Property Preservation Task Force, called this particular issue, quote, the worst problem you've never heard of.
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I assume you remember which problem I'm talking about.
Is this the heirs
This is
property
the heirs
issue?
property. Yeah,
Yes.
that
Yes.
issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, quick history lesson. Because Black people did not necessarily trust government institutions, banks who had otherwise defrauded them or, denied their loans. Oftentimes, they would not, when they owned land, they would not create wills and trusts and put that land in a trust. Okay. As the generations went by and families grew, that land was all of a sudden, it had to be distributed. The ownership of that land had to be distributed between, among cousins and uncles and nephews as these families grew. What happened as families left the South and would migrate up to the North, for example, or out to the West, a lot of those families were no longer on the land. Okay. So their portion that they owned was kind of an abstraction, right? If you're up in South Carolina, if you're up in St. Louis or you're in New York or you're out in California, you're not necessarily thinking about the 100 acres that your family, owns back in South Carolina. And because that land was then owned by multiple family members, what happened as that land that was originally not desirable, let's say Hilton Head, right, along the South Carolina coast,
Right.
that land was not initially seen as the most desirable land. That's why Black folks got it in the first place. But as the centuries, unfolded, that land became the most desirable land because it's beachfront property. And developers would seek out these family members who were up in these northern states. They would convince that one family member to sell their portion of the land that they owned, which allowed the developers then to force the sale of the rest of the property.
When the rest of the family members don't even know yet.
They don't even know.
Right.
They don't even know. And because the land had become so much more valuable, right? It wasn't always possible for the families to pay the taxes on the land, right? And so it was a way of seizing Black people's property through the court system that really, over the centuries, forced a lot of Black families to give up the land that they owned. It's a dastardly practice, and it's still going on to this day.
It's the kind of thing that if you were more naive, you might think this kind of thing doesn't happen in our country, and it does. And it's like you said, it's so dastardly. It happens all the time. I assume it's still happening. I know there are organizations now trying to work to prevent that. But thank you for shedding some light on that, because like I said, that was one of the many issues that, because that was one, I never heard about. And I think a lot of people, like that guy said, it's the worst problem you've never heard about. So thanks for that. Now, given all of these challenges and obstacles, it's not surprising that one of the other main themes that arises throughout the book is perseverance, that Black farmers, in order to stay on the land and acquire more land and maintain that relationship with the land, they've got to have a lot of perseverance. So there are a couple quotes here. In Raised and Rooted, that chapter, Derek Harper says, quote, "I'm not the type of guy who's going to give up. I'm going to keep working. I'm just taking it one day at a time." In After Tobacco, Ann Wright says, "I have prayer, faith, and the intention of never giving up. I don't give up easy." So there's a lot of that in this book. So any just thoughts on kind of what you learned, or just that notion of pure perseverance that that resonates throughout the book?
Yeah, this is part of the reason why I'm so inspired. I was inspired to tell these stories, right? About these Black farmers who, in the face of so many obstacles, constant headwinds, are still determined to keep going. To me, it's inspiring. It's hard enough to farm when things are going well, right? When all you have to think about is, the seeds and the weather, right? And whether or not you're going to get a good crop. That's just Mother Nature.
Right.
But for these farmers, in addition to all of the natural forces that could work against them, they were constantly facing and continue to face all of these obstacles that are set in their path that are structural and institutional. And yet they continue to persevere. In Derek Harper's story, when he talks about not getting access to loans or going to the farm, his local FSA office, and kind of feeling intimidated, right? Because nobody's helping him fill out his loan application, right?
Right.
So he decides, well, okay, so fine, I won't do it that way. I'll do it my own way. I'll just work a second job, save up enough money to buy my land and then buy my used equipment, right?
Right.
It's that kind of resilience and perseverance that I just find so inspiring.
So just as the book gives a lot of importance, as we've already talked about, to the past, to remembrance, to ancestors, the connection with the ancestors, the flip side is an awareness of the future, of the legacy that so many of these farmers are leaving for the generations that follow. And that idea of legacy actually started with the ancestors. For me, one of my favorite sort of images from this book, I'm just going to read really quickly, is from Black to the Land by Leah Penniman. And she says, quote, "Our ancestral grandmothers in the Dahomey region of West Africa braided seeds of okra, molokhia, and Levant cotton into their hair before being forced to board transatlantic slave ships. They stashed away amara kale, gourd, sorrel, basil, tamarind, and kola in their tresses. The seed was their most precious legacy, and they believed that we, Black descendants, would exist and that we would receive and honor the gift of the seed." So I think all of that is just so beautiful. But I also think it's really interesting because it's talking about from the ancestors are already thinking about their legacy, but it's not just the ancestors, it's Black farmers today give a lot of importance to that. There seems to be a real awareness of where they are on that spectrum. So can you, actually, I want to read another quote from Ann Wright. She says, "I talk to a lot of Black farmers and I say, don't sell your land. Please don't sell your land. We've got to have something to leave our children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren." Can you just touch on that briefly? We kind of already have earlier, but again, this notion of legacy and its importance to Black farmers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think farmers are always they're always looking forward, right? They're always thinking about the next crop, the next year with optimism, right? With hope, with a sense of determination, right? There is something in their spirit that I just find so um, heartening, right? It's that determination not to give up. It's always being able to imagine a better day.
Mhm.
And that's what I think of when I think about Ann Wright's comment, when I think about Leah Penniman, who is talking about people who were boarding slave ships with no idea where they were going, right? But having the forethought and the vision to know that at least I will, whatever is going to happen to me, whatever my fate may be, I'm going to take something with me so that I can hopefully survive wherever I'm going, right?
And so that, if I may interrupt or add, and so that those who follow me can
Yes,
survive. Thinking of the
exactly.
people, like you said, they don't even know where they're going.
Don't
And
even
they're
know.
already thinking ahead, well, we're going to figure this out. And we want to set those up,
Yes,
those who come those who
yes.
come after it. I love that. And you just mentioned hope. There are quite a few reasons to have hope in this book. Can you give us a couple of concrete examples of where, as you were putting this book together, you found reasons for hope related to Black farmers and the future of Black farming?
Yeah, well, I think I was really inspired, of course, by the older farmers, right, who have been at this for a while, who have the expertise. But I was really inspired by this new generation of farmers,
The
people
returning
now,
generation.
the returning generation, people in their 20s and 30s, early 40s, who are coming back to the land, right? And see this as a way to push the community forward, right? They are unapologetic. They have a vision. They bring, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, a real sense of activism, right? About totally changing the dynamic. And they are doing that. And that is the thing that is going to lead to change, right? They are not waiting around, they are doing it. And in the case of like Leah Penniman, she is her farm practices are farming practices that her ancestors used, right?
Mm-hmm.
So today, when you hear about regenerative agriculture, and this is a conversation that's happening now as, you know, we think about climate change and all of these issues that we are facing as a culture, we're talking about um, um, what is it? Sequestration of carbon
Oh, yeah,
sequestration,
the
right?
catchment, or I forget the, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
Where you're looking around and you're thinking, actually, if we change our farming practices and take care of the soil, then the soil will pull the carbon out of the air,
right,
put it
right,
back into the soil.
right.
This is what regenerative agriculture is all about, right? And that's like a newfangled term. But actually, what it's really referring to are these ancient indigenous practices from thousands of years ago
Right.
that
And
farmers are now beginning to use again because there's wisdom there. And it's, for the most part, it's the young farmers who are implementing those practices.
yeah, and
So,
there are a couple of instances I think in the book where, you know, the older Black farmers say, well, they call it organic now, but that's how we did it. So we didn't know.
exactly,
We were, you know, it's
this was
great.
organic farming. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, so there's so much more related to the book itself, but thanks for kind of going over some of those main
Sure.
themes that at least stood out for me. But I want to change gears now, since this is the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast and it's craft, community, and commerce. I want to talk a little bit about craft, because to me, the idea specifically about anthologies. This is an anthology. To me, it seems exciting on the one hand, but also a little daunting, perhaps, on the other, to come up with an anthology insofar as just the process and how do you make the decisions, what gets in, what doesn't. So I'm curious, in your particular, in We Are Each Other's Harvest, did you, for example, because this is a subject matter, or this is a subject that has mattered to you and been of interest to you for so long, you've probably already been reading about this. So was it a case of you already kind of knew who you wanted to have in this, or was it a case of you started with the subject and then just went out to see what was out there? Can you just tell us a little bit about how you brought it all together?
Yeah. Well, if I'm being honest, when
I
I
expect
started
nothing
this
less.
book, I had a vague, it was an impulse that I started with. It was kind of a set of questions that I had and kind of a gut feeling about what I was trying to do and explore in this book. But I'll be honest with you, Matthew. In the early days, I would hear myself describe this book to friends, and I would say, you know, I feel like it needs to have poetry and it needs to have, you know, essays and it needs to have story. That was just my
Gut.
gut feeling, but that was the artistic part of it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
That was me saying, I'm not a historian, so I cannot write this story myself. So, how can I express these ideas in a way that from a creative standpoint, right? Putting aside the hard data and the facts and the hard history, how can I kind of wrap my arms around this subject in a way that is going to convey everything that I feel about it. And really and truly, I was more influenced by art
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
film than I was, you know, by other anthologies. I wanted it to be visual. I wanted it to be lyrical. I wanted it to be poetic. And so that was really the filter
Hmm.
or the lens that I was using to decide where I went or what I included. It was more of an artistic thing for me.
Right. Did you have any, if it were my anthology, I would have questions about how much of my own work to put into it. And so there
Mhm.
are, you included, there's a chapter from Queen
Oh, yeah.
Sugar. There's, you did write a couple pieces, and then of course, presumably you're doing the interviews. Did you
Yeah.
have any sort of, how much, where do I stand on the stage here?
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I knew that I did not, this book, I didn't want this book to be about me,
Right.
right? That's
Right.
not the point. The point is to elevate and celebrate and amplify the voices of the people who are doing this work every day.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add those pieces to kind of break things up and make it a richer, more engaging reading experience. But I wanted this to be a chorus of voices. That was the only way I could imagine
Hmm.
being able to tackle this subject. I didn't want it to just be my voice.
Yep. I love that. And it's not, and I love that there's poetry and photographs and just this diverse mix of ways of talking about the subject matter. I did just mention that Queen Sugar, you did include chapter 10, which obviously
Mhm.
fit perfectly with the overall composition. You also have an entire chapter where, with screenwriter Jason Wilborn, where he's talking about being his experiences in the writing room, writing for the TV show. Um, and you also talk about your own process and journey, both in writing Queen Sugar and getting it published. And so, since again, we're kind of talking about craft now, and because I think it's always fascinating for, particularly for writers who are just getting started, right? We see someone such as yourself who has had this success. And of course, from a distance, it's like, oh, she must have, lucky her, it must have been easy. And of course, it never is. And so
Right.
you talk about, your ups and downs getting to just even publishing the book. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And specifically, I'd like to ask you about, there's a particular date, July 15th, 1999.
Mm.
So why is that particular date important to you?
Well, it was June 15th,
Oh, June. Sorry
1999.
about that. June
June
15th.
15th. That's
Yep.
okay. Because that was the day that I really planted my flag as a writer and decided that I call it my birthday as a writer.
Right.
That was the day that I left my family's business where I had been working for 11 years trying to, be in sales and coming home and writing on the weekends and on the evenings and wringing my hands about not having, you know, enough time and all this kind of stuff. That was the day that I decided, no, this is the life that I want. I'm going to figure out how to make this happen.
Hmm.
And it was a commitment that I made to myself to put writing at the center of my life, right? That didn't necessarily mean quitting, every job and not ever working again, but it meant making writing my highest priority and doing whatever I had to do to make sure that I could get to the desk and
Right.
practice my craft
Right.
every day. And June 15th, was that day.
Right. And so you weren't going to never work again. You weren't
Right.
never going to have a job again. And yet you did quit
I did.
the job that you had with your dad's firm. You were supposed to take that over. You had what sounds like a fair amount, if not a tremendous amount of security. So you did make a jump. You did
Yes.
take a big risk.
Yes.
So can you tell us how, from a more personal level, how did you make that jump? Because that's a question that so many people have, right? You talk to so many writers who haven't made the jump. They got to pay the bills. They don't know if they're ever going to get published. So are they stupid to make the jump? You
Mhm.
had some of those. I mean, we all have, anyone who's taken the jump
Sure.
has those doubts. Should I? So can you just tell us a little bit about how you found the courage and how you were able to actually make the jump, not
Sure.
knowing where you were going to land?
Sure. Well, first of all, I spent 11 years not doing this, right?
Right, right,
And so by the time I made the jump, it was really for me a matter of life and death almost, right? I knew that if I didn't do something quickly, another 11 years would go by and writing would still be on the margins of my life and I would have squandered this gift, this impulse I had. So that was first.
yep,
When I made the leap, all I knew, okay, there was a man who told me, make your decision and chart your course, right? Meaning, commit, just commit. Once I committed, there were opportunities, large and small, came my way, right? Whether it was it, so he was just saying, commit to this and then figure it out, right?
Yes.
So that meant, okay, so I take, my week's vacation and I go to a writer's conference, right? Where I discover a whole universe of writers, right? It meant joining a workshop, right? It meant finding a writing group. Eventually, it meant going back and getting my MFA, right? But none of those things would have been possible if I had not first made the commitment to myself to, no matter how long it took, to practice the craft. And I'll tell you, the only other thing that comes to mind is when I first had the inkling to write Queen Sugar, I went back to UCLA where I'd gotten my first master's. And I talked to my professor, one of my literature professors, and I told him, I think I'm going to write a novel. And he said to me, oof, well, good luck.
Oh,
You're going to
wow.
meet a lot of rejection. And he wasn't being mean, right? He was just telling me the
He's
truth.
preparing you.
He was preparing me. But
Yep.
what I said to him in response was, you know what? The day that I start getting rejection letters, at least that means that I will have thrown my hat, I'll be in the game, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of this is about expectation and mindset, and you being able to tell yourself, no matter what, I'm in this
Hmm.
and I'm going to keep going and keep working and improving my craft. And I'm going to try my best to enjoy the process, right? Because it's not just about the end game. You have to enjoy the process as you were going along.
You do. I just want to underscore one thing that you said that sort of underpinned um, that whole section, which is just this notion that, because I tell people this all the time, and I actually taught a class on intuition. And one of my big points was you, we don't get to know how it's going to work out until we make that jump. And to your point specifically a second ago, the doors aren't going to open until you make that jump.
That's
We
right.
want the doors to open so that we know that the jump is safe. But
Yes.
that's not how
So,
it works. The universe is saying, I'm going to support you, but not until I know you're serious.
yes.
So until you, like you said, until you make that commitment, until you really make that decision, because the other thing is we spend so much time saying, oh yeah, I'm going to write a book, or I'm going to do X. It might not even be about writing, right? Whatever it is in our lives. So often we say, well, I'm going to do X, I'm going to do Y. And we delude ourselves, I think, into thinking that because I'm saying I'm going to do it, I'm doing it, but
Yes.
you're
It's
not.
not the
And the
same.
universe knows you're not until you actually do whatever it is to show that you're serious. So
Exactly.
anyway, that point obviously resonated. I have another question related to this, or another, I want to read a quote from, you did an interview in the book with, this is still related to craft. In chapter 17, you're in conversation with Lolita Tademy and Margaret Wilkerson Sexton.
Mhm.
And you say, or you ask them rather, quote, how much or not does faith in any form play a role in your work or in your creative life, or more specifically, in your experience of writing these books? By faith, it could be religious faith, or it can be the universe intervening. Maybe it's just faith in yourself. So 2 questions. The first one is, why did you ask them that question?
Why did I ask? That's a great question. Why did I ask them? I think because I wanted to hear from other writers what keeps them going,
Mhm,
right? I know
mhm,
what it is for me,
mhm,
but it's always interesting to hear what makes people get back to the desk every day,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so and also, how did they feel when they made that leap, right? Because it is scary and it is uncertain. And I think that both Margaret and Lolita tell very interesting stories about the the leaps of faith that they took, right? in Lita's case, the plans that she made so that she could take that leap. I think she was more methodical about it, right? Margaret had an impulse. She had people, she started younger. She had people who were nudging her, including her mother, along the way, saying, you can do this, you can do this,
I
right?
know. Yes.
And which was a gift.
I was so
That never
jealous. I
happens,
mean, yeah,
right?
that's it. I mean, my parents support me, but I didn't get that kind of support. It was like, go get a degree in something and then you can write on the weekend. So yeah, as I was reading her story, I was like, God, she's so lucky.
You're
Yeah.
so lucky. That's what we were
Right.
saying. We're like, wow,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I wanted to hear from other writers what their experiences have been.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now I would like to, so thank you for that. And so now I would like to ask you that question specifically. How much, because you didn't answer it in the book, they
Mm,
answered it. You didn't actually answer it. And we've kind of
mm.
touched on it, but specifically, how much does faith in any form play a role in your work or your creative life?
It is central. It's central
Yep.
because I'm not necessarily a religious person, right? But I do feel connected to something bigger. And I do believe that once there's a I think it's a Buddhist saying that it's like once you step forward, life rises up to meet you, right?
Which is kind of what we were just talking about, actually.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
Exactly. And I do believe that that's true. I do believe that once you do your part and once you put in the work or begin to put in the work, opportunities that you didn't see before begin to present themselves to you. And then it's easier to move forward. It's still terrifying, right? I
Yes.
mean, every day I
Yes.
wake up and it's like, oh my God, I've got this new novel and how am I going to write this thing, right? But the
Yes.
only thing to do is to write it and to have faith in myself, in some kind of larger cosmic force, that if I just stick with it, I will figure this out, right? It will come to me. Maybe not tomorrow, right? Maybe not next week, but the more I focus my mind and my intention on the thing that I'm doing, the more I'm just going to be swimming in that water. The more my mind's going to be working, the more I'm going to be looking at the world, thinking about things.
And from a faith
Yeah.
perspective, I would suggest, and again, it depends on everybody's belief system, but this is one
Mhm.
of the main themes of my current work in progress, is this notion that another way of saying, I think what you just said, is that you will be taken care of.
Yes. Yes.
You'll be taken care of through your own doing the work. You'll be taken
Yes.
care of because that creative inspiration, wherever it's coming from, you'll be taken care of because when you can't pay the bill, someone will ask you to edit their book for
Exactly.
them.
Exactly.
And so yeah, so for me, that's kind of where faith comes in, because
Yes.
I did make the jump. I didn't know where I was going to land. I'm still figuring it out day to day, but that's been one of my big lessons along those exact lines, is the door's open,
Yes.
even
That's right.
though there are ups and downs.
There
And
are ups and
sometimes
downs.
you're waiting for that door to open and you don't see it cracked yet, but they
Yes.
do open. Okay, so thank you for that. I want to ask you, this is sort of an aside.
Mhm.
I was thinking about, this is about Queen Sugar, and I was thinking about your experience, obviously, of taking the book becoming the TV series. And something I was thinking was, we have these intimate, so one of my books is a novel, so I have written fiction, my other two are nonfiction. But we have these intimate relationships with these characters, and we grow to love the characters and the stories. And when in that chapter with the screenwriter, whose name I'm not going to remember off the top of my head,
Jason Wilborn.
Jason, he talks about how the TV show is a major departure from the book, right?
Mhm.
New characters, changes to existing characters, new storylines. So I was just curious, as I was thinking about your experience, how that might have been for you to see this creation of yours be changed by someone else into something else. Can
Mhm.
you just talk about kind of
Yeah.
what that was like?
Yeah. You
Even though at
know,
the same time, sorry, I would be so excited if Oprah wanted to make my book into a
yeah.
show.
Oh,
So I'm
totally.
sure that there was that aspect of it, but
Totally.
yeah.
Totally. You know, honestly, and this is where I think it's important to talk about community, right? I was at the San Francisco Writers Grotto as I wrote Queen Sugar
Hmm.
and had the good faith or the good fortune to be with other writers who had, to some degree or another, been down this road, right?
Hmm.
Of
Hmm.
having a project optioned, filmmakers there who had, working on projects, and enough people told me, it's going to be different, right? Whatever they do with it, it's not going to be the same thing that you imagine. So they were able to prepare me,
Oh, that's great.
first of all.
Yep.
So I did not have that expectation. Second, I invested 11 years of my life into writing Queen Sugar. That book is the very best version of the book that I dreamed of in my head when I started. And so I'm at peace, right? I am very proud of Queen Sugar, the novel. It is my heart, it is my soul, it is my spirit. Those are the characters. That book looks and feels on the paper the way it looked and felt when I would write it every day, right? So it was not difficult for me to hand it over and to say, after 11 years of living in that world, okay, I've done my thing, right? This is my vision. Now you take it and make it your vision.
And that's not
That
going to
was
take away from my vision, because my
not
vision's
going
out
to take
there.
away.
Right.
Exactly. The
Right.
two can exist, right? I
Yep.
mean, how many times have I left a movie theater where a book has been adapted to a film? If it's done well, the book is beautiful, the film is beautiful, and I have left the movie theater and walked right down to the bookstore and bought the book,
Right.
right? And
Right.
enjoyed the book just as much as I enjoyed the film.
Including the
So,
differences between the two.
but they can coexist,
Right.
right? And one
Right.
does not have to take away from the other. And so for me, I just decided that that was um, the way I just wanted to approach this,
Right. Right.
And then I was free to go on and do other stuff.
But I think something that stands out for me that you just said is just the importance of community.
Yes.
You had people around you preparing you for that, so you could be at peace with it. So you weren't
Right.
caught off guard when all of a sudden there are 5 people who you don't know those 5 people. How did they appear in your TV show?
Right.
So again, that importance of community. So much more that we could say about that. But I love that that was an angle, that was a way that you were prepared for that. So you could be at peace with that. So there's one last thing I want to talk about, because we are ending the near of our chat, unfortunately, even though we could talk for hours. I have questions that we could talk for hours and hours, but there's one thing. So writing the book, bringing attention to the cause of Black farmers, Black land ownership, giving so many of the people in this book the voice that you gave them, that is all a tremendous service. And you're doing something else that's even sort of more direct. And I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that. So can you talk about the Black Harvest Fund?
Yeah. So the Black Harvest Fund is a donor advised fund that I've started with the idea that some of the proceeds from this book will go into that fund. I have some very kind and generous seed donors who have also made
Pardon the
contributions.
pun. Sorry.
Yeah, I
Pardon the
know.
pun. That was too
I didn't
easy.
even think about
That was
that.
too easy.
I didn't
I had
even
to
think
call
about
attention to that one. Okay. You've got some
But
great seed donors.
right. And
Yeah.
so, because what I want to do is really use this as an opportunity to now support the people who are doing the work. So this Black Harvest Fund will give grants to nonprofits that are helping Black farmers, whether it's through education. So there's a very small organization in Okolona, Mississippi called the Mississippi Black Farmers Alliance. Their whole goal is to educate young people in their community who want to be farmers, right? They need help.
Right.
So my fund will now be able to give them a grant so that they can continue their work. And it's my way of giving back to the people in the communities who shared their stories with me. And it's a way for me to continue my support for a cause that I believe in. And it's just, I just wanted to do something. And
Right.
this was what I was able to do.
And
So.
how can people join you in contributing?
So they can go to my website and there's a tab along the top that says Black Harvest Fund. And they click on that and it gives all the information about all the ways that they can donate. Yeah. And I'm collaborating with the San Francisco Foundation. They are my kind of fiscal sponsor who is handling all the money. So it doesn't come to me. It goes directly to the San Francisco Foundation, to the Black Harvest Fund, and then I will be able to
give the grants.
Great. Glad to know that you're not taking all the money from
I'm
your
not
from your efforts. Okay, great. Thank you, Natalie. This has been so great. I loved the book. I know that so many people are going to love and learn so much from the book and be inspired by the book and angry because of the book and hopefully empowered because of the book. So thank you for sharing that with me. We Are Each Other's Harvest, I believe, is out April 6th. Is that still the plan?
Yep,
Okay,
that's the
April
plan.
6th. So it's out imminently. For more about the book, Natalie just mentioned her website, but specifically that's nataliebaszile.com. I'm Matthew Felix. More about me at matthewfelix.com, and more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, including details about the new expanded writing contest this year, as well as lots of virtual events that are going on right now, is at sfwriters.org. Until next time, thanks again, Natalie, and thank you very much for joining us.